Two countries spent decades claiming the same uninhabited rock by taking turns leaving each other whiskey and schnapps. But first, if you could like this video, it would be acknowledged and noted in your permanent record. So picture this, it's 1973, and Canada and Denmark are sitting down to draw a line through the Nares Strait, carving up who gets what in the freezing waters between Greenland and the Canadian Arctic. They're dotting I's, crossing T's, being very diplomatic about the whole thing. And then they get to Hans Island, this tiny speck of rock sitting smack in the middle of their proposed boundary, 1 kilometer wide, completely uninhabited. Used occasionally by Inuit hunters, but otherwise just sitting there being cold and unimpressed with human politics. And both countries look at it, look at each other, and apparently decide the mature thing to do is just pretend it doesn't exist. They sign their agreement and leave Hans Island out entirely, like maybe if they ignore it hard enough, it'll solve itself. Spoiler, it did not solve itself. The thing is, both countries had actual legal claims they thought were pretty solid. Canada pointed to the 1880s when they'd acquired the territory from the Hudson's Bay Company, because apparently you could just buy enormous chunks of the Arctic back then like you were picking up groceries. Denmark, meanwhile, said Hans Island was obviously part of Greenland, which they controlled and therefore theirs. Reasonable people might have hashed this out in 1973, but instead we got what became known as the Whisky War, which is possibly the only international territorial dispute that sounds like it should be resolved by a drinking game. Here's how it worked. Starting in the 1980s and continuing for decades, military personnel from both countries would periodically sail out to this frozen, barren rock, plant their flag, remove the other country's flag, and leave a bottle of alcohol. The Canadians would leave Canadian Club whiskey. The Danes would leave schnapps. No shots fired, no harsh words, just a very committed game of capture the flag with a liquor exchange program. Peter Toksvig Jensen, who was the head of international law at the Danish Foreign Ministry, actually explained this on record. When Danish military go there, they leave a bottle of schnapps, and when Canadian military forces come there, they leave a bottle of Canadian Club. He said this like it was a completely normal aspect of international relations, which I suppose it had become. Now, you might think this would eventually just fade away as both countries got bored, but then in 2005, someone decided to escalate things. And by escalate, I mean Canada's Defense Minister Bill Graham personally visited the island. He didn't send a representative. He didn't make a statement from Ottawa. He went there himself, presumably looked around at the whole square kilometer of frozen nothing, planted a Canadian flag, and left. The Danes were not amused. They filed an official diplomatic protest because apparently when you've been playing passive-aggressive flag games for 20 years, a cabinet minister showing up counts as provocation. The Danish foreign minister, Per Stig Møller, agreed to reopen negotiations on the dispute, which is how you know things had gotten serious. They were actually going to talk about it instead of just swapping booze in silence like some kind of Arctic pen pal program gone wrong. And here's the thing about the entire Whisky War. It stayed funny. Both countries maintained their sense of humor throughout the whole thing. Nobody actually got angry. Nobody threatened anyone. There was no saber rattling, no military buildups, no stern warnings about national security, just Canadians and Danes taking turns visiting a rock that neither of them actually wanted for any practical purpose, leaving each other drinks like the world's slowest, coldest cocktail party. This went on until 2022. Let me repeat that, 2022. Nearly 50 years after the original agreement that ignored the island's existence, Canada and Denmark finally sat down and decided to do something wild. They split it. They drew a line roughly along a natural ridge running through the island, gave about 60% to Denmark and Greenland, gave the rest to Canada, settled the maritime boundaries while they were at it, and called it done. Denmark's parliament ratified the agreement in December 2023, making it official. So after decades of flag swapping, liquor deposits, one mildly dramatic ministerial visit, and countless opportunities to turn this into an actual problem, the two countries just divided an uninhabited rock in half and went home. The island that started this whole thing is still cold, still empty, and now has an international border running through it that matters to absolutely no one except cartographers and the people who update Google Maps. The Whisky War is over, resolved by the radical strategy of adults having a conversation, and somewhere in the Arctic there's probably still a half-empty bottle of schnapps sitting next to a flag no one's coming back for. If you'd been in charge in 2005, would you have sent the defense minister to assert sovereignty, kept quietly swapping bottles like a rational person, or suggested splitting the island 40 years earlier and saved everyone the trip? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, stay unhinged.